A Russian drone crossed into NATO territory, crashed onto a sleeping family's rooftop, and Vladimir Putin stood before cameras the very next day and shrugged. That is not an accident. That is a signal and what it signals about the state of this war should alarm every person watching. Stay with this until the end, because what unfolds across these next few minutes will completely change how you see this conflict. At almost the exact same hour, Putin was deflecting reporters in Kazakhstan. A Ukrainian strike package was tearing into the training camp of the one brigade his own Kremlin had decorated for what it did in Bucha. That's the collision worth sitting with for the next few minutes, because those two events are not separate. The man who annexed Crimea to a hero's welcome in 2014 is now watching the supply roads into Crimea choke shut, watching his most infamous unit get hunted 100 kilometers behind the line, and watching a drone with his country's fingerprints on it drift into NATO airspace and detonate over a sleeping family. Each of those on its own is a headline. Together there's something heavier, the sound of consequences arriving all at once on a clock he no longer sets. It's June 1st, 2026. The war is in its fourth year, and for the first time the pressure is moving in only one direction. If you want the money and the geopolitics decoded without the theatrics, stay with this, because the Romania piece is where it gets genuinely dangerous. Start there. Galați, Romania, a city of roughly 250,000 people, maybe 10 miles from the Ukrainian border. In the early hours of May 29th, Romania's defense ministry says a Russian drone crossed into its airspace, got tracked on radar all the way to the southern edge of the city, and crashed onto the roof of a residential block, triggering a fire and leaving 2 civilians needing treatment. 2 F-16s were scrambled. A NATO early warning aircraft went up to widen the picture. And then came the language that should make every American sit up, because Romania is not a bystander to this war. Romania is us. It's a NATO member. Article 5. An attack on one is treated as an attack on all. And the United States is the spine of that promise. Romania's president called it the most serious incident on his national soil since the full-scale invasion began. NATO's Secretary General said the alliance will defend every inch of Allied territory. The U.S. ambassador to NATO called it a reckless incursion. Reports counted it as the 28th time Russian drones have breached Romanian airspace since Moscow started hammering Ukrainian ports along the Danube. 28 times. Sit with that number. Because the official story Moscow wants you to hold on to is navigation error. A stray drone, a glitch, the unavoidable mess of a war happening next door. And maybe a single incident is a glitch, but you don't glitch into the same NATO country's airspace 28 times by accident. And you don't deflect the way Putin did, standing in Astana asking reporters who exactly in Romania decided this was a Russian drone, saying no one can know the origin of any drone until there's been an examination. Unless the ambiguity itself is the point. That's the part the calm coverage tends to skate past. The deniability isn't a byproduct, it's a tool. You send something that's clearly yours, you let it do damage on protected soil, and then you stand there and shrug and wait to see what the alliance actually does about it. That's not a navigation failure. That reads a lot more like someone running a finger along the edge of the table to find out exactly where it ends. And here's why that matters right now in this specific week, rather than as some abstract worry. A regime that's winning doesn't probe. A regime that's winning doesn't need to find out where the line is because it's setting the line. The probing starts when the math at home stops working. And Russia's math, by every available measure, has stopped working. So, before we go anywhere near Crimea or the money, hold this thought as our first open loop. The Romania strike might not be a sign of Russian strength reaching outward. It might be a symptom of Russian weakness leaking out the sides. Keep that in your back pocket. We're going to come back and close it because the battlefield turned. Quietly, without a single dramatic map-changing moment, but it turned. Look at the cold accounting. The analysts at Russia Matters, working off Institute for the Study of War data, found that over the 4 weeks ending May 26th, Russian forces posted a net loss of around 100 square miles of Ukrainian territory. The single week of May 19th to the 26th was Russia's largest weekly territorial loss of the entire year. Read that twice. The invading army, the one that's supposed to be grinding forward, spent the back half of May going backwards faster than at any point in 2026. Ukraine's commander-in-chief said his forces had clawed back roughly 16 square kilometers around Pokrovsk, that fortress city in Donetsk, that Russia bled itself white to enter over the winter, retaking villages like Kotlin, Udakny, and Shevchenko. Russia took Pokrovsk early this year, and then simply couldn't do anything with it. Couldn't push west. The breakthrough that was supposed to crack open the rest of the Donbass never came. The map just stalled, and now it's reversing. What changed? Drones. Not as a buzzword, as a regime of control over physical space. Ukraine's defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, put numbers on it that are worth hearing slowly. He said that back in October, Russia was losing about 67 soldiers for every square kilometer it advanced. By April, that cost had climbed to 179 men per square kilometer. He claims Russia is losing more than 35,000 soldiers killed or seriously wounded every single month. Now those are Ukrainian figures, and you treat any wartime ministry's numbers with a healthy squint. Both sides inflate. That's the nature of it. But you don't have to take Kiev's word for the trend, because Russia's own military bloggers have been saying the quiet part for weeks, that their men are drowning in drones, that the airspace over their rear is no longer safe, that the deep rear they used to resupply in peace has become a kill zone, reaching 100, 160, sometimes 200 kilometers behind the contact line. Putin himself, at that same Kazakhstan appearance, conceded that Ukrainian drone attacks inside Russia are getting harder to stop. When the man whose entire brand is total control admits something is getting harder to stop, that's not nothing. That's a tell. There's a detail inside this that keeps coming up because it's the kind of thing that decides wars and never makes the thumbnail. Ukraine's defense ministry credits part of this drone advantage to Starlink being switched off for Russian forces. Think about what that does. Modern drone warfare runs on connectivity, coordination, retasking, real-time eyes. Take that away from one side and hand a widening technological edge to the other, and the whole physics of the battlefield shifts. Russia is now reportedly so rattled by this that the city of Nizhny Novgorod created, and this needs to be stated precisely because it sounds invented and it isn't, a dedicated municipal body to defend itself against Ukrainian drones. A Russian city standing up a bureaucracy whose job is surviving the skies. That is the war coming home in a way the Kremlin spent 4 years insisting it never would, which brings us to the second front and to the part of the title that hasn't been paid off yet. The war criminal Ukraine just took out. On the night of May 29th into the 30th, Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, the drone units, under the commander known by the call sign Magyar, ran a deep strike against Russian training grounds and military camps tens of kilometers behind the line. One of the targets, according to both Ukrainian military statements and reporting from the Kyiv Independent, was a camp used by the 64th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade. If that name doesn't ring a bell, here's why it should. The 64th is one of the units Ukraine identified as responsible for the massacre at Bucha. That suburb northwest of Kyiv, where, after Russian forces withdrew in the spring of 2022, investigators uncovered mass graves, and Ukraine's prosecutor general said hundreds of civilian bodies were recovered from the wider region. Bucha is the name that turned special military operation into a war crimes case in the eyes of half the planet. And now here's the part that makes the strike land like a verdict rather than just a battlefield event. After Bucha, after the bodies, after the global outcry, Vladimir Putin didn't disown that brigade. He elevated it. In April 2022, he personally conferred honorary guard status on the 64th. He congratulated its command and personnel on what the Kremlin described as exemplary conduct. So, when the title says Ukraine took out Putin's war criminal, that isn't loose language. That's documented. Putin decorated the Bucha unit. He made it his. And nearly 4 years to the season later, Ukrainian drone operators put that unit's camp in their sights from roughly 100 kilometers out and struck it with one daily war briefing, putting the dead at no fewer than 9. The symbolism is doing as much work here as the tactics. Ukraine isn't just hitting logistics and training grounds at random. It's reaching deep and choosing targets that carry meaning. The unit Putin honored for the atrocity that defines this war's moral record. That's a message, and the intended recipient is sitting in the Kremlin. The same wave of strikes, by the way, reportedly destroyed two Tu-142 long-range naval reconnaissance aircraft and an Iskander missile system at Taganrog inside Russia. The Iskander being the very system that's killed Ukrainian civilians in city after city for 4 years. So, in a single night, you've got the Bucha Brigade hit, 2 rare aircraft gone, and a launcher tied to the bombardment of Ukrainian homes turned to scrap. That's not a probing raid. That's a campaign with a thesis. And the thesis points straight at the third front, the one that, more than any battlefield map, threatens the thing Putin actually cares about. Crimea. Here's what's quietly unfolding in the south and why it's the most underrated story in this entire war right now. On May 27th, Fedorov announced a program he called the Logistical Lockdown, a roughly $113 million push to scale up Ukraine's mid-range strike drones and systematically strangle Russian supply lines deep behind the front. The idea is brutal in its simplicity. You don't have to defeat an army in the field if you can stop its trucks. No fuel, no shells, no food, no rotation of men. An army that can't move, can't fight, and eventually it can't even hold. And the artery they've gone after is the R280. The road Russian occupiers rebranded the Novorossiya route, running from Rostov through Mariupol and Melitopol down into Crimea. The land bridge? Ukrainian intelligence sources cited in Ukrainian reporting claim that around 125 Russian trucks were hit on key logistics routes, with over 80 destroyed or burned, and they admit that's probably an undercount. Now, watch what happens downstream of that, because this is where it stops being a military abstraction and starts being a fuel pump that won't dispense. The Russian-installed occupation head of Kherson signed a decree in late May restricting non-essential traffic on that highway, citing the drone threat. In Sevastopol, the crown jewel, the home of the Black Sea Fleet, the Russian-appointed governor acknowledged that filling stations ran out of gasoline and diesel was only sporadically available. Manar Insa Waxis Wansidwar. Occupied Crimea introduced fuel vouchers. Footage out of Melitopol showed long lines of cars queuing to refuel. A Finnish analyst tracking this described it bluntly. If this isn't an attempt to retake territory, it's an attempt to slam the door on Crimea. Cut the peninsula off from the mainland supply, and you don't have to storm it. You isolate it, you let the lights flicker, and why does that specifically threaten Putin in a way that losing a few villages near Pokrovsk does not? Because Crimea isn't just real estate to him. Crimea is the founding myth. The 2014 annexation is the moment the modern Putin brand was forged. The bloodless triumph, the restoration of greatness, the thing that sent his approval ratings into the stratosphere, and let him present himself as the man who reversed history's humiliations. Crimea is the proof of concept for the entire project, which means any sign of instability on that peninsula isn't a logistics problem, it's a legitimacy problem. It cuts at the part of the story Putin tells Russians about why all of this, the bodies, the sanctions, the isolation, was worth it. Fuel lines in Sevastopol are a political event dressed up as an inconvenience. That, by any honest reading, is the real reason a drone wandered into Romania this week. Not strength pressure. A regime cornered on 3 fronts at once, reaching for the one lever it has left, fear, and waving it at NATO to see if anyone flinches. But the front that decides all the others isn't on any map. It's the budget. And the Russian budget right now is bleeding in a way that's getting genuinely hard to hide. The numbers tell the story better than any battlefield update. For 2026, Russia allocated 16.84 trillion rubles, about $238 billion, to defense and security. That's nearly 40% of the entire federal budget. 4 out of every 10 rubles the Russian state spends is now going to the machinery of war and the security apparatus around it. That alone is the number of a country that has reorganized its whole economy around a single purpose. Then it gets worse for the Kremlin. The government planned for a deficit of 3.8 trillion rubles for the entire year. In the first 4 months alone, the deficit hit 5.9 trillion, already 55% over the full year plan by April, and the largest shortfall since the invasion began, running at roughly 2.5% of GDP. And on May 29th, the same day as the Romania strike, the same window as the Bucha Brigade hit, this all happened in one compressed handful of days. The Financial Times reported on a letter from Russia's finance minister, Anton Siluanov, warning that war spending was on pace to blow past the budget by at least another 2 trillion rubles, about $28 billion, with a darker scenario doubling that. According to that reporting, Siluanov asked the government to suspend trillions of rubles in planned non-military spending this year, and trillions more in 2027 and 2028 just to keep feeding the war. Suspend the spending that isn't war. Read between those lines. The roads, the hospitals, the civilian future, defer it because the front comes first. How thin is the cushion? Russia's liquid reserve fund, the rainy day buffer that let it absorb the early shock of sanctions, has drained from something like $185 billion down to under $36 billion. The Economic Development Ministry slashed its 2026 growth forecast to a barely breathing 0.4%. Interest rates have been sitting around 16%, and the strain is showing up where ordinary people live. Rising loan defaults, company failures, payment delays cascading through the business sector, even restaurant closures. And here's the cruel twist for the Kremlin. They should be swimming in money right now. The US-Israel war on Iran that flared in late February sent oil above $100 a barrel for the first time since 2022, which is normally a windfall for a petrostate. But even that wasn't enough. The FT noted the surplus from higher energy prices was largely offset by weak revenue elsewhere. And Ukraine has been quietly attacking the supply side of that equation too. Zelensky said long-range strikes have cut Russian oil refining by around 10% in recent months, forcing energy companies to shut down wells. So, the one thing that was supposed to rescue the budget got partially neutralized by drones hitting refineries. Layer on the geopolitics of money. China, the lifeline, the supposed unlimited partner, was reportedly asked for macroeconomic support and said no. India, which had been hoovering up discounted Russian crude, saw its share of Russian oil imports fall from around 40% in 2024 to roughly 25% by early this year, with Washington leaning on New Delhi to cut it further. The buyers are getting skittish, the reserves are draining, the deficit is running at multiples of plan, and the finance minister is writing letters asking to gut everything that isn't the war. That is not the balance sheet of an empire on the march. That's the balance sheet of a regime spending its future to buy a little more present. So, now let me close that loop left open at the top, the Romania one. Put the 3 fronts and the money side by side and ask the honest question, does a Russia that's winning probe NATO's airspace deny it did and dare the alliance to respond? Or is that exactly what a Russia does when the front is reversing, the symbolic units are getting hunted, the crown jewel peninsula is running out of gas, and the treasury is hemorrhaging faster than oil at $100 can refill it? No one should pretend to read Vladimir Putin's mind. Nobody honest can, and anyone who tells you they know what he fears in the dark is selling something. But the pattern can be read, and the pattern says escalation toward the alliance tends to be the move of the cornered, not the confident. The drone over Galati is what pressure looks like when it has nowhere left to go but sideways. That's the part the measured headlines won't quite say out loud, not because it's hidden, but because connecting these dots requires holding the battlefield, the symbolism, the peninsula, and the budget in your head at the same time. And most coverage takes them one at a time, which is the genuinely dangerous bit, and the reason this isn't a faraway story for an American audience. A cornered nuclear power probing the edges of a US-backed alliance is the single most combustible setup in modern geopolitics. Article 5 isn't a slogan. It's a tripwire that runs straight through Washington. Every breach of Romanian airspace is a small test of whether that tripwire still means anything, and Moscow is running the test on a loop 28 times and counting, precisely because the answer determines how much room it has to maneuver as everything else closes in. For markets, that's the tail risk nobody's pricing on a quiet week. The chance that one of these navigation errors kills enough people or strays far enough that an alliance feels it has to answer. Oil's already jumpy from the Iran war. A NATO-Russia friction point on top of that isn't a European story. It's an energy price story, an inflation story, a risk asset story, and it lands in American retirement accounts whether or not anyone in America was watching Galati. And underneath the macro, there's the human arithmetic that keeps surfacing, because it's the thing that ultimately breaks regimes. Fedorov's claim of 35,000 Russian casualties a month, even discounted heavily for wartime spin, describes a furnace. The rising cost per kilometer, 67 men in October, 179 by April, describes an army paying more and more for less and less. And a finance minister begging to suspend the civilian budget describes a state that has quietly decided its own people's near-term future is an acceptable sacrifice. You can hold a front line with that math for a while. You can hold a myth together with it for a while. The question that hangs over all of it, over Crimea's fuel lines and Sevastopol's empty pumps and the drones smoldering on a Romanian rooftop, is how long a while lasts when all three fronts in the bank account are moving against you at the same time. So, here's where this lands tonight on the 1st of June with the war in its fourth year and the pressure finally measurably running one way. Putin's whole project was built on the idea that he could absorb any cost the West imposed and outlast everyone's patience. The time was his ally, but the territory is reversing. The Bucher Brigade he decorated is being hunted. The peninsula that made him is running dry, and the treasury that funds all of it is draining faster than even a $100 barrel can fill. When a man's entire strategy was endurance, and endurance is the exact thing starting to fail, what does he reach for next? And how far over a NATO border is he willing to let it drift to find out who's still afraid of him?